Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Get comfortable and relax.
It was September of 2019 when I drove up alone into the forests of eastern Oregon. I had just turned 34. I'd been working a job in Seattle that had drained me for over 5 years. I quit in August, gave up the lease on my apartment, and decided to go completely off-grid for a while. No phones, no people, just me and the trees. The idea came from a buddy who told me about an old logging cabin out in Union County that he and his cousin used once. I wasn't close with him anymore, but I remembered the name of the forest road. The cabin had supposedly been built in the 1950s by a logger who used it for hunting season. From what I could remember, it was abandoned, but still standing. No electricity, no plumbing, just a small fireplace, wooden floor, and a hand pump. Well nearby. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't want luxury. I wanted quiet. I packed my old Chevy Tahoe with a few essentials: a jerry can of fuel camping stove, sleeping bag, cold weather gear, a hand axe, a small cooler full of simple food. Nothing that could spoil quick, and a .38 revolver I kept for safety. Not that I thought I'd need it. I'd been in the woods plenty before, but something about this trip made me want it close. The drive out took about 9 hours. I left from Yakima, crossed the Columbia, and followed side roads deep into the national forest. Once the paved roads ended, I took gravel and dirt tracks through dense pine and fir. The road forked in places. I made mental notes of each turn, took a few pictures of the landmarks with an old digital camera I kept just in case I lost my way. It was evening when I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I imagined. Just a single room with a tin roof and weather-worn logs that looked dark from years of rain and snow. There was a rusted chimney sticking out the top, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I pushed it with my shoulder. It gave way with a loud groan. Inside was thick with dust. A spider's web hung across one corner near the ceiling, and the floor creaked when I stepped. There was a built-in bunk against the far wall and an old table in the middle with a lantern still sitting on it. A tiny window above the bunk looked out into the trees. I opened it for a little air. I didn't mind the musty smell. It was shelter, and it was mine for as long as I needed. I spent the first evening setting up. I swept the floor with an old broom I found leaning against the wall. I cleared out a rat's nest from the fireplace and laid fresh tinder inside. I took a long look at the surrounding woods, familiarizing myself with what trees stood where. I made note of the slope of the land, the position of the sun, how the tree shadows fell at dusk, the small details like that matter when you're alone in the woods. That night was quiet. No cell service, no radio, just the sounds of the forest. I lay in my sleeping bag on the wooden bunk, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind. Occasionally, I'd hear a snap in the trees or the low hood of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. The second day, I explored the area more. About 100 yards behind the cabin was a ridge that dropped down toward a dry creek bed. Along the slope were old stumps, probably leftovers from logging years ago. I found animal tracks too. Deer, mostly maybe elk. I took my revolver with me in a shoulder holster, though I didn't expect trouble. I didn't plan on hunting either. I just liked having it on me. I marked a few trees with a red cloth strip for my pack so I wouldn't get turned around, especially once it started to get cloudy. In the afternoon, it rained a little. I stayed inside, made some instant coffee on the little stove, and watched water beat up and slide off the metal window frame. On the third day, something felt different. I noticed it when I went outside around noon to chop some kindling. There were boot prints in the dirt path near the fire pit. Not mine. I wore a wide tread hiking boot. These were narrow and deeper, like a work boot. At first, I thought maybe I had stepped there before and just didn't notice. But the spacing of the prints and the depth told me they were new. I looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had come through the clearing while I was asleep or out. I walked the perimeter, checked the trees. No sign of anyone. Still, it bothered me. I cleared the prints away with a pine bough and kept my revolver loaded on the bunk that night. The fourth night was the first time I woke up feeling genuinely on edge. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. It was soft footsteps, slow and careful moving just beyond the walls. The trees are so close to the cabin that you can't see much unless it's daylight, and the window was too small to look out properly. I stayed dead still in my bag, staring at the door. I could hear the wind, then another step, then nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my ears open until sunrise, gripping the handle of the revolver with both hands. When daylight came, I stepped out. Nothing was there, but I found the prints again. Fresh, same shape. Whoever it was, they came back during the night. From then on, I stopped feeling alone out there. I started checking the woods constantly. I stopped venturing too far. I began cooking with less smoke. I kept the window closed at night. Something had shifted. The woods no longer felt empty. I started to get paranoid. Every snap twig, every rustle of leaves put me on alert. I started locking the cabin door at night using a hook and latch I found in the back wall. A week in, I found something that nearly made me pack up and leave right then. It was early morning. I was walking to check the path I'd taken to the ridge. I had a bad habit of stepping the same trail each day, which I now realized could have made it easy for someone to watch or follow. About a 4-mile in off to the side, I noticed a small dead pine with bark stripped off one side. I almost passed it until I saw something hanging from a nail driven into the trunk. It was a Polaroid photo, old bent sun-faded. It showed the front of the cabin. My cabin's same angle you'd see from the treeine. The photo had no date, but it wasn't that old. And whoever took it had to be standing right there in the trees watching. I didn't know what to do. I stood staring at that tree for a long time. Then I took the photo down, folded it in half, and slipped it in my pocket. I didn't want to leave it there. I hiked back with my hand on the grip of the revolver the entire way. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the bunk, with my back to the wall, watching the door, listening. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time, I didn't wait. I got up slowly, took the revolver, and opened the door fast. There was no one, just darkness, trees swaying in the wind. But the ground in front of the door had new prints. And not just one pair, 2, maybe 3. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I stayed up until sunrise. I kept the fire low and the door shut. When daylight came, I packed my bag. I didn't even eat. I loaded the Tahoe and sat in the driver's seat thinking I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want to drive those roads, tired, paranoid, half-aware. So I told myself I'd leave at noon. That gave me time to rest a little, think straight, and drive out in daylight. Around 10 Central a.m., I noticed something out the window. Movement in the trees, a shape then gone. I stood and went to the door. At first, I saw nothing. Then about 50 yards out, behind a thick pine, I saw a man. He was just standing there. He wasn't looking at me. He was turned slightly to the side like he was waiting or listening. He wore a dark jacket, maybe green or gray, and a cap pulled low. I couldn't see his face. I didn't move. I didn't lift the gun. I just stared. After maybe 30 seconds, he turned and walked back into the woods. Not fast, just calm, like he didn't care that I saw him. I grabbed my keys and drove out immediately. The forest road felt longer than I remembered. Every turn I second-guessed. Every shadow looked like someone standing still. I didn't relax until I hit pavement miles later. I didn't call the police. What could I say? No one broke in. No one spoke to me. There were no threats, just silence. But it wasn't right. I didn't tell anyone about the photo until months later. I keep it in a drawer, now folded like it was that day. I've looked at it 100 times. Sometimes I think there's something in the trees in the background, a shape, a face, but I can never be sure. I haven't been back to the woods since. I moved to Boise and started a new job in an office. I keep the doors locked. I installed cameras. I double-check windows at night. And sometimes, even now, I wake up at 3:00 a.m. and listen. Not for ghosts, not for monsters, just footsteps, just footsteps. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I was 34 then, living in a small town in southern Oregon and working long hours as a mechanic. I'd gotten into a habit of doing 12-hour days at the shop 6 days a week. I don't even know why anymore. Maybe it was just the routine. But one morning, I woke up and felt this heavy pressure in my chest. Not a heart issue, just a kind of emotional weight that made me realize I was worn down, tired of the noise, the people, the grease, the constant ringing of the shop phone. I needed out, even if just for a few days. So I took a week off, packed up my old Ford F-150, and brought my dog Jasper with me. Jasper was a 4-year-old German Shepherd I'd raised since he was a pup. Strong, alert, loyal as hell, and always by my side. The idea was simple. Find somewhere remote, spend a few quiet nights in a cabin, hike around during the day, maybe fish a little. No phones, no noise, no people. I booked a small cabin in central Idaho, just west of Cascade. The place was about 3 miles down a dirt road that branched off the highway, nestled in a patch of forest near a lake. The listing said it was rustic. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no cell signal, just solar panels and a propane tank for heat and light. That was perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Wednesday morning, around 5:00 a.m. Took me close to 9 hours to get there. The drive was smooth. By the time I reached the dirt road, turn-off, the sun was already low. Tall pine trees lined both sides of the road, and everything was glowing orange under the sunset. I rolled the window down and took a deep breath of pine and cold air. Jasper sat up in the passenger seat, ears up, sniffing the air too. The cabin appeared after about 10 minutes of bouncing down the rocky road. It was smaller than I expected. One-room wood plank, siding a short porch, with a single step, and an old metal chimney sticking up from the roof. No nearby structures, just woods in every direction, and the faint sound of water slapping against the lake, maybe a few hundred yards away through the trees. I unlocked the front door with the code the owner had sent me, stepped inside, and felt immediate calm. The place was simple, but clean. One bed, a table, 2 chairs, a propane stove, some shelves with canned food and dry goods, and a big wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a hand pump for water in the small sink, and a composting toilet in a little shed out back. Jasper explored every corner of the cabin while I brought in our bags and some groceries I'd picked up along the way. I put fresh batteries in my lanterns, and flashlights cracked a couple windows and got a fire going in the stove. By the time I was done, it was dark outside, the kind of pitch black that you only get deep in the woods. I stepped onto the porch with Jasper and just listened. Silence, except for the trees creaking a little and something splashing in the lake. That first night was peaceful. I read a few chapters of a book by lantern light while Jasper curled up at the foot of the bed. I didn't bother setting an alarm. I knew I'd wake with the sun. The next morning, we got up with the light and walked down to the lake. I carried a thermos of coffee and watched as Jasper trotted around the shoreline, sniffing things and occasionally wading up to his knees. It was colder than I expected. My breath came out in white clouds, and the lake was covered in low mist that drifted slowly above the surface. I didn't see a single person or boat. It felt like we were the only 2 living things for miles. I spent most of that day hiking. I had a good map the cabin owner left behind, hand-drawn, with a few trails marked in red ink. We stuck to one that looped around the lake and climbed a small ridge before circling back. Jasper was in his element, always ahead of me, occasionally stopping to look back and wait. The forest was dense but beautiful, full of tall pines and thick moss-covered ground. The air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe. We didn't return until late afternoon. I was sore but relaxed, and Jasper was covered in burrs and mud. I cleaned him off, fed him, made some canned chili for myself, and lit another fire. The temperature dropped fast once the sun dipped. By 8:00 p.m., it was already in the 30s. I remember lying in bed that night, listening to the fire crackle with Jasper breathing slow and steady nearby. I thought to myself, this is exactly what I needed. The third day was when things started to feel off. It was small, at first, little things. I took the same trail again, planning to go further this time. Maybe take a fork I hadn't noticed the day before. About an hour in, Jasper stopped walking. Just stopped cold, his ears straight up, staring into the woods off the left side of the trail. At first, I thought maybe he saw a deer or a squirrel, but he didn't chase after it. He just stood there staring, tail stiff, body rigid. I called to him, but he didn't even glance at me. That's when I started to get a weird feeling in my chest. Nothing specific, just a quiet kind of unease. Eventually, he moved again, not toward the woods, but back to the trail, sticking closer to my side than usual. We hiked a bit further, but the feeling stuck with me. Couldn't shake it. And every few minutes, Jasper would glance back over his shoulder like he was checking for something. We turned around earlier than I planned. I told myself it was just animals. Maybe a bear or coyote he had picked up the scent of. But when we got back to the cabin, something wasn't right. The front door was closed, but the handle felt warm to the touch. That caught me off guard, because the cabin had no central heat, just the wood stove inside, and I hadn't left it on that morning. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart starting to beat harder. The inside looked the same at first glance, but the chair at the table had been moved slightly. Not far, just enough that I noticed. I was sure I hadn't left it that way. The blanket on the bed looked like it had been touched too, just rumpled enough to stand out. My boots, which I had left lined up by the door, were now about a foot apart. I stood in the doorway, gripping the handle of my pocket knife. I listened hard, held my breath. Nothing, just the ticking of the old wall clock and the creak of the wood stove as it cooled. Jasper walked in ahead of me, sniffed everything. He didn't seem alarmed. That helped me calm down a bit. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I had moved that chair and forgotten. Still, I locked the door that night and slid one of the chairs under the handle. I kept the flashlight and my hunting knife next to the bed. Jasper slept light that night, waking up every so often to lift his head and listen. The next morning, I found footprints outside. Not mine, not Jasper's. These were bigger, wider set, and they came from the woods behind the toilet shed. They circled the cabin once, then stopped right outside the back window. The glass was smudged like someone had leaned in to look. I squatted by the prints and studied them. They were deep fresh, made by someone wearing heavy boots. The soil was soft from dew, and the edges were clean. Whoever it was had been standing there some time after dark and before sunrise. I didn't like that. Not one bit. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close, checked the area around the cabin, made sure the truck was still fine. I even walked back down the dirt road a bit to see if maybe someone had parked off the side. No sign of anything. The rest of the day dragged by. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every sound from the trees had me looking up. Jasper was edgy too. Ears flicking at every rustle, sitting at the door for long stretches like he was waiting for something. That night, I barely slept. Around 2:00 a.m., I heard something. Not inside, but close. A crunch. Then another slow, deliberate steps in the dry leaves outside the cabin. Jasper stood up immediately, tail down, teeth bared, but not growling, just listening. The steps moved around to the side of the cabin, then stopped. I turned off the lantern, total darkness. Jasper moved to the door and sat unmoving, just staring. I knelt beside him, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it through the walls. We waited. The steps started again, this time moving away toward the trees behind the cabin. They faded. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I made a decision. We were leaving early. I packed up fast, loaded the truck, locked the cabin, and we were on the road by 7:00 a.m. The woods didn't look peaceful anymore. They looked like they were watching me. As I drove down the dirt road, I spotted something in the ditch about a half-mile from the cabin. A pile of cigarette butts, a crumpled food wrapper, and a clear boot print in the mud pointing toward the trees. Someone had been out there, living out there, maybe watching the cabin, maybe more than one night. I made it back to Oregon that evening, called the cabin owner from a gas station, and told him what I found. He didn't say much, just thanked me and hung up. I don't know if he ever looked into it. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know this much. Jasper knew before I did. If it weren't for him, I probably would have brushed off the weird feeling and stayed longer. Maybe hiked further. Maybe bumped into someone out there who didn't want to be found. Sometimes when I'm walking Jasper through town at night and he stops suddenly to look at a bush or a dark alley, I get that same chill I felt in the woods, like something's there watching. Only now, I always listen. And I always trust my dog. Always trust my dog. I hadn't seen Julia in 6 years. We split in 2017, and the divorce wasn't bitter, just silent. We didn't fight. We didn't scream. We just stopped trying. After all those years together, we drifted like two old boats in separate currents. She kept the cabin in Colorado, and I moved to Phoenix. That was the last time we spoke. Just the papers, just the signatures. In early spring 2023, I got the call from her brother. Julia had passed, heart failure, 48 years old, no kids, no partner, still living alone in that cabin off County Road 16 just outside of Buena Vista. She had neighbors, but not the kind you saw often. A few seasonal folks, but that part of the Rockies stayed pretty quiet most of the year. He told me she mentioned me in her will, not money or anything. Just asked if I could go out there and collect some of her things. You'll know what to take, the note had said. He wasn't sure what that meant. I wasn't either, but I agreed. I figured I'd drive up, spend the night, maybe 2 at most, clean up, whatever I thought she meant, and leave it behind me for good. A part of me wanted to go not just out of guilt. I hadn't thought about Julia much, but hearing she died like that alone made me feel something I didn't expect. Not regret, just a hollow kind of sadness. Like something unfinished got smaller, but never disappeared. I packed my truck with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some food. March in the Rockies wasn't full winter anymore, but it could still freeze at night. Snow still hung in patches along the roadside and in the shady parts of the trees. The drive from Phoenix took most of a day, and by the time I pulled onto the dirt road leading to her cabin, the sun was already low. I remembered the place, but it looked older than I expected. The cabin was wood-stained dark from years of weather. 2 stories, but small, just a loft upstairs where we used to sleep. The porch had warped. A few planks were curled up near the edge. The satellite dish was rusted and drooping. I saw the old Jeep she used to drive, still parked under the pines beside the cabin, covered in pine needles and a flat front tire. I killed the engine and just sat there for a minute. The woods were quiet, real quiet. Not just peaceful, more like the world had taken a breath and held it. I stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, crisp and damp, like it had rained in the morning. There was a smell I remembered, pine with smoke and something faint underneath it all like muster rot. The front door was unlocked. Inside, it looked just like it had years ago. Almost nothing had changed. Furniture was in the same place. The small table near the window still had a ring on it from my coffee cup years back. The living room had one of those old wood stoves and a pile of cut logs beside it. The stove was cold, though the last ashes in it looked fresh. Maybe her brother had been here. I checked the fridge, unplugged, cleaned out, cabinets were half full. Spices, canned soup, dusty cereal boxes. Upstairs in the loft, the bed was made tidy bare except for a wool blanket and one pillow. That part hit me hard for some reason. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the silence pressing in. Her brother had said she was found in the armchair by the fireplace. I stood over it looking down. The cushion was worn in a distinct way, like she had sat there often, always the same position. A folded blanket was draped over the back, and a small table beside it held an empty tea mug, a book face down, and a flashlight. I spent an hour going through the house. I didn't know what I was looking for. Something that told me what she meant by "you'll know what to take." I opened drawers, looked under furniture, even checked the attic. Nothing jumped out. By dark, I gave up. I lit a few candles and sat in the chair where she died. I thought maybe just sitting there might help me feel closer to her, but it didn't. The room felt cold, not temperature. Wise, just hollow. I didn't sleep much. I lay in the loft with the blanket pulled tight, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Now and then, the wood popped in the walls or something shifted on the roof. Every noise stood out loud and sharp. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps across the porch. I held my breath, waited nothing. By morning, I convinced myself it was a deer or a fox. The next day, I started to box up a few things. Books, photos, her journal, which I didn't read, just placed in a small box. Then I found something strange in the back of the closet in the hallway. An old duffel bag I didn't recognize. It was zipped, tucked behind boots and coats. Inside were notebooks, folders, and a cheap digital recorder. I sat down at the kitchen table and flipped through the contents. The notebooks were filled with Julia's handwriting, but it wasn't her usual stuff. These were lists, timeline sketches of the property with marks on certain trees or landmarks. One page caught my eye. It was dated just a few weeks before she passed. He was there again, standing near the tree line. I didn't move. He didn't either. I waited until he was gone, but he comes back. Always around 3:40 a.m. watching. That didn't sound like the Julia I remembered. I thought maybe she'd been sick for a while, maybe paranoid. I flipped through more pages, each one documenting what looked like sightings. Times, dates, weather conditions. Always the same note. Man near tree line doesn't move, doesn't speak. Watching. I pushed the notebook aside and picked up the recorder. The battery still worked. I clicked play. Her voice came through soft and tired. It's March 2nd, 3:51 a.m. He was back. Same spot, no movement, no sound. I turned the porch light on. He didn't react, just stood there. I don't sleep anymore. I shut it off. My stomach turned a little. Maybe it was just her mind slipping in the last year of her life. Living out here alone can mess with you. I knew that, but still something felt off. I went outside and walked toward the edge of the woods, where she said he'd been seen. The trees were thick there, the undergrowth dense. I looked for boot prints, anything, but snow had melted and refrozen so many times that nothing clear remained. I did find something, though. A small pile of cigarette butts under a tree. Not old, not new either. Maybe a few weeks at most. Julia never smoked. That evening, I lit a fire in the wood stove and sat on the floor with the recorder flipping through more of her notes. She had drawn the same man multiple times. Always vague, tall, heavy coat, some kind of hat, just a shape really. No face, no features. That night the feeling came back. Heaviness, like the air inside the cabin, got thicker, harder to breathe. I tried to sleep again in the loft, but I couldn't. At exactly 3:38 a.m., I woke up without knowing why. I sat up, listened. Nothing. Then the crunch. One step, then another. Outside. Slow, steady, deliberate. My heart froze. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The footsteps reached the porch. I heard the boards creak. Then nothing. I sat there for 10 minutes, maybe more, holding my breath. The fire had burned low, and shadows danced across the ceiling. I got out of bed slowly and crawled to the window overlooking the front. He was there. I swear to God he was there. A man stood at the edge of the porch, not facing the cabin, but slightly turned like he was looking past it into the woods. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight. Nothing. I blinked. He was still there. I stayed low, heart-hammering. I wanted to yell, wanted to shine a light, but I couldn't move. Then just as quietly as he came, he turned and stepped off the porch, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep. The sunrise, I walked out there. The porch showed faint marks in the frost, just enough to tell me someone had been there. I followed the direction he went, weaving through pine and aspen. After 10 minutes of walking, I found something. Plastic chair, just a regular old patio chair, worn and cracked from weather. Defaced the cabin from a small clearing. Around it were cigarette butts, empty water bottles, and snack wrappers, all arranged neatly in a plastic bag beside the chair. He had been watching her from that spot. For how long, I couldn't tell. But based on the trash and Julia's notebooks, maybe months, maybe years. I went back to the cabin and boxed up the notebooks, the recorder, and a few more things. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That my dead ex-wife thought someone was watching her, and I saw a man standing on the porch. I left the cabin just before noon. I locked the door behind me and threw the key into the woods. I wasn't coming back. Back in Phoenix, I took her things and stored them in the closet. I haven't looked at the notebooks since, but I think about them every night. What gets me isn't just that someone might have been watching her all that time. It's that she knew. She knew, and nobody believed her. She died alone in that chair, probably exhausted and scared. And now I carry that truth like a weight. Sometimes around 3:40 a.m., I still wake up suddenly, and I swear I hear the sound of a footstep outside, a footstep outside, It was the fall of 2016 when I took a temporary park ranger job in northern Idaho. I was 32 at the time, single, no kids, and not exactly tied down. I had worked seasonal outdoor jobs for years, moving state to state Forest Service fish and game trail maintenance, whatever I could get my hands on. I liked the quiet. I liked the woods. I liked being out of cell range and away from noise. That's part of why I said yes. When they offered me a month-long posting at a remote cabin in the Selkirk Mountains, not far from the Canadian border. The cabin was used by full-time rangers in the summer, but by October, most of the traffic died down. Hunting season had just started, but this part of the range was under a permit-only system, and only a few hunters were allowed each week. My job was to log weather data, monitor wildlife activity, and do daily radio check-ins with the main office 40 men away. I'd be alone up there, but that never bothered me. The cabin was a sturdy A-frame structure built back in the early 70s. It sat about 12 miles from the nearest forest road, reachable only by ATV or hiking in. I took the Ranger Issoud Polaris up there, bouncing along the rough 2-track trail with a pack full of food, my sidearm, a basic med kit, and a thick binder full of instructions. It was cold already, mid-40s during the day, dropping to the low 20s at night. Snow wasn't on the ground yet, but you could feel it in the air. There was no electricity, just a propane stove, a gas lantern, and an old cast iron wood stove. The cabin had one room and a small loft, plus an outhouse about 50 yards away, tucked behind some pines. There was a shed, out back, stacked with chopped wood, a map table inside, and an old twin bed with a thick wool blanket. It was basic, but I liked it. Peaceful. The first week went by slow, but smooth. I settled into a routine. Wake up with the sun. Brew coffee on the propane burner. Log the overnight temperatures from the analog thermometer outside the door. Walk the Rargeline Trail that looped back to the cabin. Scan for wildlife with binoculars. Make notes on any tracks or scat I saw. Then return by mid-afternoon to do my check-in by radio. After that, I'd chop kindling reed, or just sit out on the front steps and listen to the wind in the trees. I saw elk a few times, heard coyotes most nights, and even caught a glimpse of a black bear moving through a draw below the ridge. But around the start of the second week, something started to feel off. It started with small things. One morning, I woke up and found the front door open. Not wide, just a few inches. But I was sure I'd locked it before bed. I always did. It wasn't windy that night, and the latch wasn't loose. I wrote it off as maybe not shutting it fully, even though I double-checked everything before going to sleep. Then I noticed that one of the fuel canisters was missing from the shed behind the cabin. I brought in 4 on the Polaris, 3 small green ones and 1 bigger white can. I'd been using one of the small ones for the lantern, but the big one was gone. I thought maybe I'd miscounted. I searched the shed, checked the ATV, even walked around the cabin, thinking maybe I set it down somewhere dumb. But it wasn't there. 2 days later, I found footprints. They were behind the cabin, near the edge of the tree line, in a patch of soft ground where moisture held the shape. The tread was from a hiking boot, maybe a size 10 or 11. They weren't mine. I followed them for maybe 50 FT before they vanished into harder ground. They weren't deep, which meant whoever it was wasn't carrying a heavy pack. It wasn't one of the hunters either. I had the list of permits, and all of them were camped at least 5 miles south of me. I reported the prints over the radio, and the guy at HQ just told me to be alert. Sometimes people hike up from the other side of the range without permits, trying to poach or just get away from people. He told me to log any more signs of activity, but didn't sound too concerned. That was easy for him to say. He was sitting in a warm office with cell service and a fridge full of soda. I kept my handgun a little closer after that. It was a standard issue Glock 20 10mm. I wasn't too worried about animals, but people make me nervous, especially out in the woods where no one else is around. I started locking the door every time I left, even if it was just for a short walk. A few days passed with no new signs. I told myself maybe it was a drifter just passing through. The temperature was dropping, and most people didn't want to be up this high. After October, I went back to my routine, though I found myself looking over my shoulder more often. I kept checking the tree line when I stepped outside and walked a little faster on the trails. Then one night, I heard the cabin creak. That's not unusual. It was old, and the cold made the wood shift and groan. But this was different. I was lying in bed reading by lantern light, and I heard a soft creak near the door like someone stepped on the porch. Then silence. I turned the lantern off and just lay there in the dark listening. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. No wind, no animals, just cold, dead quiet. After about a minute, I got up slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I held the gun in my other hand. I went to the door and listened. Nothing. I opened it fast and shined the light outside. Empty. The forest looked back at me dark and still. I stepped out, circled the cabin with the flashlight sweeping the ground and trees. I didn't see anything, but the feeling in my chest stayed tight. Something had been there. I was sure of it. In the morning, I found cigarette ash on the porch just a little near the corner post. I don't smoke. I haven't in years, and no one else was supposed to be anywhere near me. I looked around again for tracks, but didn't see any. I felt a weird mix of anger and fear. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through anymore. They were watching the cabin, maybe waiting for something. I called it in again. This time, HQ said they'd try to get a ranger out in a few days to check in person, but the schedule was tight. They told me if I felt in danger, I could hike out early, and they'd arrange a pickup. I said no. Maybe I was being stubborn, or maybe I didn't want to feel like I was running from something invisible. That night, I stayed awake in my sleeping bag with the lantern off and the gun beside me. Around 2 Sazerd in the morning, I heard something again. A faint scraping sound outside the window. Not the door this time, one of the side windows facing the slope behind the cabin. I sat up heart pounding and waited. The sound came again like metal on glass, slow and deliberate. I crept over and peeked out the corner of the window just enough to catch the edge of the glass. Nothing. The moonlight was weak, filtered through clouds. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no running, just silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, not moving, not blinking. When it got light, I walked out and saw the scratch. It was on the window, thin and deliberate like a knife or nail had been dragged across the surface. Whoever it was, they were messing with me, testing how far they could push it. I radioed HQ again, more insistent this time. They said a ranger could come up the next day, maybe late afternoon. I agreed to stay one more night. I didn't have much choice. The weather was too cold to try hiking out, and the ATV trail was too rough to make it back after dark. That final night was the worst. I stacked furniture against the door. Not that it would do much, but it made me feel better. I loaded the Glock and kept extra rounds on the table. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, facing the door, with the lantern off and a blanket over my lap. The night dragged on. I counted seconds, minutes. My ears hurt from the silence. Then around 3:40 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. One step, then a pause, then another. They weren't trying to be quiet. I gripped the gun tighter. The steps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. Nothing. Just breathing. Not mine, someone else's. I could hear it through the thin wood, steady and calm. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps. Not hard, just enough to be heard. I didn't move. I didn't respond. The breathing stayed for a few more seconds. Then the steps backed away. I listened to them fade into the forest. The next day, the ranger showed up. A guy named Roy. He was in his late 40s, tough and no nonsense. I told him everything. He looked around, saw the scratch on the glass, the cigarette ash, the footprints. He didn't say much, but he didn't act surprised either. He said there had been stories about people living off the grid out here, survivalist types, sometimes ex-cons people who didn't want to be found. Some just wanted space. Others were dangerous. Roy stayed with me that night, and in the morning we both rode out. He said they'd close the cabin early for the season and file a report. That was it. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. I don't plan to. Whoever that was, they knew I was alone. They knew how far I was from help. They knew my patterns, my schedule where I slept. They didn't break in or attack, but they didn't have to. They wanted me to know they were there. That was enough. And it worked. And it worked. It was October 2022 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 31 years old, then single, no kids, and had been working long shifts as a warehouse supervisor in Cleveland. I had started to feel that dull hum in my chest every morning. That heavy, tired feeling that comes when you go through the same thing every single day. Wake up before sunrise, commute, lift, yell, eat lunch standing, go home, sleep, repeat. Weekends didn't feel like rest anymore. They just felt like shorter versions of the weekdays. So I took a week off. I remembered a cabin my uncle used to take me to when I was a teenager. It was deep in the woods outside a small town called Hamlin in northern Pennsylvania. The place hadn't been used in years, but I had the keys and knew the trail. It sat by a quiet lake down a winding dirt path, no longer marked on any modern GPS. The cabin wasn't much, just a single bedroom, a small wood stove, and a deck that faced the water. It wasn't connected to any power grid, no internet, no plumbing. You had to haul in water or get it from the lake and bring everything you planned to use. And that was exactly what I needed. No noise, no people, no pressure. Just air, trees, and quiet. I packed up the basics. Canned food, propane stove, sleeping bag, some extra batteries, lantern, a revolver I kept mostly for bare safety, and enough firewood to last a few days. My plan was to stay for 5 nights, maybe hike around the lake, fish, sleep. In late. I didn't tell anyone the exact location, just mentioned I'd be in the woods, and left a general area with my friend Mike. Cell reception was spotty out there, and I didn't expect to be reachable. That was part of the draw. I got to the trailhead around noon and parked in the small clearing that used to be part of an old Forest Service road. From there, it was about a 40-minute hike to the cabin. I had a rucksack on my back and a smaller cooler strapped to a sled I dragged behind me. The air was crisp and cool, the trees full of orange and yellow, and the only sound was the wind and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and once I was out of sight of the road, I felt like I had left the world behind. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating a little, but it felt good. The place looked almost exactly how I remembered it. Wooden steps slightly tilted. A screen door with a bent corner windows clouded with dust and age. but it was still standing. And when I opened the main door, the inside smelled like dry wood and cold air. I checked for animals or signs of squatters, but everything seemed untouched. The mattresses were old, but clean enough. No mice droppings or nests. I set up my lantern and started unpacking. That first day went smooth. I boiled some water on the propane stove and made coffee while sitting on the deck watching the light shift on the surface of the lake. It was calm like glass. I didn't hear a single plane overhead or see any lights across the water, just trees and quiet. That night, I lit a fire inside the stove and read an old paperback by flashlight. When I laid down to sleep, the silence was so thick it almost had weight. I heard a few night sounds, maybe a raccoon or some deer crunching through the leaves, but it didn't bother me. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel strange. I had spent the day hiking the ridge trail that wrapped around the far side of the lake. It was slower going than I remembered. More overgrowth, more fallen branches, but I made it to the other end by early afternoon. I spotted an old deer blind in the woods, half rotted and covered in moss. That part of the forest felt heavier somehow. I remember getting this odd tightness in my stomach when I passed it like a subtle warning. But I brushed it off and made my way back before sunset. Back at the cabin, I heated up a can of chili and ate on the deck again. The air had cooled down fast, and I could see my breath a little. I was just finishing up when I heard a sound from the trees. Not close, not loud, just a single sharp crack, like a thick branch snapping. It came from up the trail I had used to hike in. I stood still, listening. The forest was quiet again. I figured it was probably just a deer. Still, I went inside and locked the door. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things, light footsteps, maybe scraping noises outside. But every time I looked through the window or stepped out with my flashlight, I saw nothing. The sounds would stop, and the woods would be dead still again. I told myself it was probably a raccoon, maybe a porcupine. Nothing worth worrying about. The next morning, I found something strange. On the edge of the deck, right near where the steps met the ground, was a small pile of smooth stones stacked on top of each other. 6 of them balanced neatly, like a tiny caw. I hadn't done that. I was sure of it. I hadn't even seen any stones like that near the cabin. They weren't dirty or covered in moss. They looked like they had come from a creek bed, flat gray clean. I looked around for tracks, but didn't find any. The ground was packed with leaves, hard to tell if anyone had walked there. Still, it made my skin crawl a bit. I knocked the stack over and tossed the stones into the woods. That afternoon, I stayed closer to the cabin. I kept my revolver holstered on my hip just in case, but I didn't see anything else strange. Still, the air felt heavier. I started noticing how quiet everything had become. No birds, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed slower, just the occasional rustle in the brush far off. Every time I walked around the side of the cabin, I felt like something had just moved out of sight, like I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I laid in my sleeping bag gun next to me, flashlight in hand, and listened. Around 1:00 a.m., I heard footsteps this time clearly. They were light but deliberate, coming from behind the cabin. I froze. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the lantern was off. I stayed still, listening to the steps as they circled the building slowly. At one point, they stopped just outside the wall where my head was. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed. I heard nothing. Then slowly, the steps moved away. I got up, turned on my flashlight, and checked every window. Nothing. I opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and scanned the woods with a beam of light. Nothing, just trees and dark. But on the railing, another stone stack. This time taller. 8 stones. I swept it off and locked myself inside. I kept the revolver close and didn't sleep. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was done. 5 nights was too long. I would leave that day. Something was wrong out there, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I packed everything fast, stuffed my gear into the rucksack, rolled up my sleeping bag, and strapped the cooler to the sled. I was almost ready to go when I noticed something else. On one of the trees facing the cabin just about eye level was a mark. It hadn't been there before. It was a rough X shape carved deep into the bark with something sharp, not with a knife. It looked like it had been done with a chisel or a hatchet. It looked recent. Fresh shavings still clung to the cut. I looked around at the other trees. 3 more had the same mark. I didn't wait any longer. I headed down the trail at a fast pace, dragging the sled behind me. My head was on a swivel the whole time. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every shadow looked like it was moving. About halfway to the car, I started to get that feeling again, that someone was behind me. I stopped and turned around twice. Nothing. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I felt some relief, but it didn't last. The back window was smashed in. The driver's door was hanging open. I stood there, stunned. My keys were in my pocket, so whoever had been out there had broken in without trying to steal it. I approached slowly, revolver in hand. The inside of the car was mostly untouched glove box, opened some papers tossed. The only thing missing was the emergency kit I kept in the trunk. It had a hatchet rope, first aid supplies, some food rations. I didn't waste time. I got and started the car and drove until I had signal again. I called Mike, told him I was fine, just cutting the trip short. I didn't mention anything else. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office later that day, told them about the break-in, the stone stacks, the footsteps. They were polite, but uninterested. Said it was probably some kids messing around, but they took the report and thanked me. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I heard that a hiker had gone missing near Hamlin. A guy in his late 20s vanished without a trace. Last seen parking his car near a trailhead. Same trailhead I had used. They never found him. Sometimes I still think about those stone stacks. How precise they were. How quiet the woods became. And how whoever or whatever was out there never said a word, never left a message, just signs marked steps in the dark. And sometimes I wonder if they had been watching me long before I noticed. But most days, I just remind myself I got out, and I'm never going back. And I'm never going back, My name is Josh, and this happened in the fall of 2019 when I was 34 years old. I live in Montana, and I've always been someone who enjoys being out in the woods. I used to go on solo hikes and overnight camping trips in remote areas just to get away from everything. Back then, I worked in construction, and between the noise, the dust, and the long hours, I looked forward to quiet weekends on my own more than anything else. That year, things had been kind of rough. I had just come off a long project in Billings, and during the final week of it, my old truck died on me. I had to spend a big chunk of my savings getting another one, a beat-up 2004 Chevy Silverado that needed a lot of work, but it ran. The day after I got it running decent, I decided I needed a break from the city. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded. I remembered this old cabin my uncle had mentioned years back. He was a surveyor and used to travel all over the state marking land and checking boundary lines. He told me once about a place northeast of Helena, near a place called Wolf Creek, way back off the paved roads. He said there was a small one-room hunting cabin, abandoned but still standing. It sat a few hundred yards from an old family graveyard, just wooden crosses and a few stone markers. He didn't know who built it or who the graves belonged to, but he said the place had a weird feeling. That was enough for me. Sounded quiet, remote, and interesting. I loaded up my gear, filled a cooler with food and water, packed my 308 just in case, and left early Friday morning. The weather was cold, but not yet snowy. The roads were clear, and after I got through Wolf Creek, I turned off onto a series of gravel and dirt roads that wound through the hills. I passed through patches of pine and long stretches of dry grasslands. Took me almost 5 hours to find the spot. I didn't have exact coordinates, just a rough description and a few landmarks to watch for. A split boulder next to a bent pine, an old fence line half buried in brush, and a slope with red rocks scattered like teeth. I found it all eventually and pulled off onto a barely there 2-track road that led down a gully and up a rise. And there it was. The cabin sat on a flat patch of land surrounded by thin pine trees. Behind it, up a small incline, I could see the graveyard. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few wooden posts stuck in the ground, weathered and tilted. A couple stone markers leaned at odd angles. No fence, no gate, just there. The cabin itself looked like hell. The wood was gray with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and one window had been busted out long ago, but the door was still there, hanging on its hinges. And when I stepped inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a rusty bed frame, a rotting mattress, and a broken chair in the corner. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry and quiet, and that was good enough for me. I spent the first hour unloading the truck and cleaning up inside. I swept out rat droppings, cleared cobwebs, and laid out my sleeping pad on top of the mattress so I didn't have to touch it directly. I set up a little cooking station outside with my propane stove, and after that, I cracked open a beer, sat down, and just listened. It was quiet in a way most people don't ever hear. No cars, no voices, no phones, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird. That first night was uneventful. I made some soup, ate it sitting on a rock out front, and watched the sky turn orange, then dark. I had a small lantern, but I didn't use it much. I just laid there with my jacket over my sleeping bag, staring up at the wood beams, and drifted off sometime around 10 Sarzar. I woke up once, maybe around 2 Sarzar in the morning. I wasn't sure why. No sounds, no wind, just dead silence. I thought maybe I dreamed something. I listened for a while, holding my breath. It felt too quiet, but eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I got up early and walked up to the graves. I was curious. There were maybe 8 or 9 markers total. Only 2 had names carved into the stones, and they were hard to read. One looked like it said Josephine D., 1894, and the other, Inslellen, 1911. The rest were just old crosses, some fallen over. No dates, no names. It didn't feel spooky, just sad, like a piece of history, forgotten by time. I stood there a while, sipping my coffee, then went back down and made breakfast. Around mid-morning, I decided to explore the area a little. I hiked a few ridges over just following game trails and looking at the land. I saw deer scat lots of birds and one half-collapsed shack deeper in the woods that looked like it had been a tool shed. Nothing unusual. But when I came back to the cabin in the afternoon, something small bothered me. I had left the lantern hanging on a nail just inside the door, but it was on the ground, tipped over. I was sure I hadn't left it that way. I told myself maybe the wind had blown through the broken window and knocked it down. Or maybe I wasn't as careful as I thought. I brushed it off. That night, though, I couldn't sleep as easy. I kept hearing things. Small sounds, like light footsteps outside. Not constant. Just 1 or 2 every now and then. I'd hold my breath and listen, then silence again. It was probably animals. Rabbits, raccoons, maybe even a deer, but they sounded closer than I liked. I sat up once and looked out the window. It was dark. I didn't use a flashlight because I didn't want to give away my position if anyone was out there. My hand rested on the rifle beside my sleeping bag for the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I found a boot print about 10 FT from the front door. Not mine too small, like a size 9 maybe. I wear a 12. I checked all around, but that was the only one. One print in soft dirt, then nothing. That put a knot in my stomach. I thought maybe someone was squatting in the area or a hunter was passing through. It was public land, but they would have had to know I was there. My truck was parked out front. Why sneak around at night? I made the decision to stay one more night and leave in the morning. I was already packed light, and I didn't feel like rushing. I still tried to enjoy the rest of the day. I stayed close to the cabin, gathered wood, cooked early, and kept my rifle close at all times. That night, I locked the cabin door with a makeshift wedge. Just a thick branch jammed under the handle. I kept my boots on slept light and didn't drink anything. I was alert. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something. A soft knock. Not on the door, on the wall near the back. Just one knock, then silence. I didn't move. I just laid there with my heart hammering in my chest. After a few minutes, I heard another sound. Dirt crunching footsteps, slow one at a time, circling the cabin. I stayed still, rifle in hand. The steps stopped at the window. I heard breathing, just for a second, then nothing. I waited until sunrise. I didn't sleep at all. When it was light, I stepped outside, rifle shouldered. No one around. I walked the perimeter, checked for tracks, but the ground was dry and hard-packed. Nothing obvious. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. Up by the graveyard, one of the wooden crosses had been pulled out of the ground and laid flat. Not broken, just moved. That was it for me. I packed up in 10 minutes, left the rest of the firewood behind. I threw everything in the truck and peeled out down the trail, bumping over rocks and cutting corners way too fast. I didn't relax until I hit the highway. I never went back. A few weeks later, I told my uncle about it. He shrugged and said he wasn't surprised, That area used to be part of some old ranch that failed 100 years ago. Some of the family might still be out there off-grid living in the woods. He said he'd heard stories about people who don't like strangers on what they see as their land. I didn't ask any more questions. I've camped a few times since then, but never alone, never near graveyards, never in that part of the state again. Whatever happened that night wasn't paranormal. It wasn't ghosts. It was someone real. Someone who watched me from the trees, waited until dark, and crept close. Maybe just curious, maybe worse. But I got lucky. I left before I found out. And that's all I ever needed to know. It was the spring of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 29 years old, then burned out from working construction jobs all around Nashville. I needed a break, even if it was just for a week or two. I had some money saved up, and I figured I'd take a trip out to the countryside. My old high school buddy Matt had told me about a family-owned farm his uncle left behind near a small town called Camden. He said it had been abandoned for years, but was still standing. The main cabin on the land had no electricity or running water, but he said if I just needed peace and quiet, it was the place to go. I jumped at the idea. I borrowed his directions, packed up my truck with enough kin-food water, a battery-powered lantern, a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, some tools, and a shotgun just in case. It was about a 3-hour drive west of Nashville, mostly through winding back roads and old country highways. The deeper I got into Benton County, the more the surroundings felt untouched. Endless fields, scattered woods, rusted barns, and run-down homes that looked like they hadn't seen people in decades. The road leading up to the property was a narrow dirt path, more weeds than road. Tree branches scraped the sides of my truck as I slowly pushed through. Eventually, the trees opened up to a wide field, and there it was, an old one-story log cabin with a small porch tilted slightly to one side like it was leaning from exhaustion. A collapsing barn stood in the distance, half swallowed by tall grass. Beyond that, the tree-line pressed close. The whole place felt isolated in a way that was hard to describe. Quiet didn't even begin to cover it. The air felt heavier out there. Not dangerous, just different. I parked near the cabin, got out, and stretched. The place smelled like wild grass, sun-baked wood, and damp earth. I walked up the steps to the porch. One of them creaked and cracked under my foot. The door was unlocked, just like Matt said it would be. Inside the place was dark and stale. Dust covered everything, counters, shelves, floors. There were 2 small rooms. The main living space, with an old iron stove, a wooden table, and a few chairs, and a back room that had a busted cot and a wall of cracked windows facing the trees. No bathroom, no plumbing, just an outhouse near the barn. According to Matt, that first day, I spent some time cleaning out cobwebs, airing the place out, and setting up my gear. I kept the door and windows open while I swept and wiped things down. I didn't mind the work. It felt good to do something physical without anyone breathing down my neck. That night, I sat on the porch with a can of chili, my flashlight in my lap, and the stars above me. It was quiet, like deep quiet. No hum of traffic, no sirens, no voices, just the sound of bugs, an occasional owl, and the breeze rustling through the fields. I went to bed early, laying my sleeping bag out in the main room on the wooden floor. I left the shotgun next to me just in case. It was just me out here. The first couple of days went by without anything strange happening. I explored the property, some found an old well covered with rotting boards, and wandered through the barn, which was filled with rusted tools, broken ladders, and piles of hay that smelled like they'd been there since the 90s. I saw a few animal tracks here and there. Deer raccoons, maybe a stray dog, but nothing that seemed threatening. On the third night, I woke up around 2:00 a.m. to a sound. First, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it again, metal clinking, faint but clear. I sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from outside, maybe near the barn. I turned on my flashlight and stayed quiet listening. A few seconds later, it stopped. I waited still. Nothing. After 10 minutes or so, I chalked it up to wind, or maybe something falling. I laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep for a while. The next morning, I walked out to the barn after breakfast to see if anything looked out of place. A rusty shovel had fallen over, but that was it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just being alone for so long. It messes with your head. But the next night, I heard it again, around the same time. This time, it was louder metal clinking, but also a dragging sound. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun and went to the window. I couldn't see anything, just the faint outline of the barn in the dark. I opened the door, slowly stepped onto the porch, and listened. It was dead silent again, not even crickets. I walked out to the barn. Every step felt louder than it should have been. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see my breath even though the night wasn't cold. That was the first time I really felt scared. Not just nervous scared. I stepped inside and swept the flashlight across the interior. Nothing moved, just the same clutter of tools, beams and hay. But then I noticed something new. A set of tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boots fresh. They led to the back of the barn, where an old tarp was draped over something large. I followed slowly, heart through-tooing. I lifted the edge of the tarp and shined the light underneath. It was a cage, an old rusted animal cage, big enough for a large dog, or maybe a hog. Inside it were chains, and beside it, a red gas can that made me step back. There was a smell, too faint but sharp, like old blood and oil. The cage had clearly been used recently. I stood there frozen for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. Then I turned and got out of that barn fast. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with the shotgun across my lap, watching the windows. Nothing happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about that cage. The next morning, I decided I needed to check the rest of the property. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I needed to know if someone else had been out here. I followed the tracks from the barn. They led toward the trees. I pushed into the woods, flashlight and shotgun in hand, moving slow and careful. About 50 yards in, I found another trail, one that didn't look natural. The grass was flattened, branches were snapped, and I spotted more boot prints in the mud. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A buried metal drum. Just the lid was sticking out of the dirt, covered in leaves. I stepped closer and brushed it off. It looked like a chemical barrel, maybe 55 gallons, no markings on it. I tapped it with the butt of the shotgun. Sounded hollow. I tried to lift the lid, but it was sealed tight, rusted shut. I circled it and found drag marks behind it in the dirt, like someone had pulled it into place. and next to it was a pile of cloth scraps, what looked like torn shirt pieces, and a single work glove. I stood there, trying to breathe. My brain was going through all kinds of reasons for why it could be there, trash storage, whatever. But it didn't feel right. I backed away and marked the tree next to it with my knife, just in case I needed to find it again. Then I went back to the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I should leave or call someone. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't deny what I'd found. Someone had been here, and recently that night, I didn't sleep again. I stayed up lantern burning low shotgun ready. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching the dry grass outside the window. I turned the lantern off, picked up the shotgun, and crouched low. I could barely breathe. The steps moved along the side of the cabin toward the back. Then they stopped. I stayed frozen for minutes. Then I heard it, the slow creak of the back window. I had checked them earlier. They didn't lock. I pointed the shotgun toward the sound. Heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else, but nothing came in. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I stayed like that until dawn. As soon as the sky turned gray, I packed my things fast. I didn't care about leaving food or gear behind. I loaded my truck, checked all around the cabin, then got in and drove. I didn't even look back. On the way out, just before the dirt road met the highway, I passed an old shed I hadn't noticed before, hidden by trees. I don't know what made me stop, but I did. I got out and walked over. The door was locked with a thick chain. I tried pulling it, but it wouldn't budge. I looked through a crack in the wood, and what I saw made me stumble back. Inside were at least 4 more barrels, and in the corner, a small table with something white on it, maybe bones. I didn't stay to check. I drove straight back to Nashville and told Matt everything. At first, he thought I was messing with him, but when he saw my face, he went quiet. We called the local sheriff's office and made a report. I gave them the location, everything I saw. They said they'd send someone out. Weeks went by. No one ever followed up with me. I called a few times and got the same response. We're looking into it. Eventually, I gave up trying. I never heard from anyone again. A year later, Matt told me the property had been sold off quietly. He didn't know to who. To this day, I don't know what exactly I walked into out there, but I know someone had been using that cabin and that barn and that shed for something they didn't want anyone to find. I know I was being watched. I know the footsteps were real. And I know I got out just in time. I haven't been back to the country since. And I never will. Never will. Never. I was 37 when I decided to spend a week in a small hunting cabin that my uncle had once owned near Elkader, Iowa. It was deep in the northeastern corner of the state, not far from the Mississippi River. He passed away in 2012 and left it to my dad, who hadn't touched it since. It sat unused for 4 years. I didn't even know it was still standing until I asked my dad if he knew a good place I could disappear for a week during hunting season. He told me the roof probably leaked, that mice might have taken over the place, and the only heat was a rusted old wood stove in the middle of the main room. But it was still ours. And it was deep in the woods on a patch of land that was still legal hunting ground. That was good enough for me. I wanted silence. No phones, no noise, No people, just me, my rifle, and the quiet. I needed it more than I could explain. I'd just been through a rough stretch. Divorce layoffs, bills stacking up. My sleep was shot. My patience was thin. I didn't have kids, but if I had, I know I wouldn't have been able to look them in the eye back then. Everything about me just felt tired. I wasn't suicidal, not like that. But I needed to feel something again. Needed to see something besides concrete and credit card statements. I figured cold air and long walks in the woods would do more for me than any pill or therapy. So I loaded up my pickup in early November and took the 5-hour drive out from Des Moines. The land started to get hillier after Cedar Rapids. More trees, more color still hanging onto the leaves. By the time I reached Elkader, it was all red barns and frost-covered fields. The road to the cabin wasn't even a road. It was a barely visible trail that branched off a gravel road, and it hadn't been cleared in years. I had to get out twice to move branches, and the mud nearly swallowed my front tires a couple times. The cabin sat up on a rise hidden behind a few oaks and maples that had mostly shed their leaves. It was one story, maybe 20 FT wide and 30 FT deep, with siding that was gray with age. The tin roof looked like it had held up better than I expected. The windows were cloudy and stained, but unbroken. A small porch with 2 wooden chairs. One of them collapsed sideways, like someone had sat down too hard a decade ago and never fixed it. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the truck was the quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs at night. I mean real silence. Just the occasional creak of trees swaying. Maybe the distant flap of a crow's wings. No traffic, no phones, no TV buzzing in the background. It was unsettling for the first few minutes, but I grew into it. It felt like I'd been underwater for years and had finally surfaced. I got the door open with some effort. The wood had swelled and stepped inside. Dust kicked up as I moved. The smell was strong. Mussed wood old rodents. Cobwebs in every corner. The floor creaked, like it was complaining about being stepped on. But it was still solid, still standing. The inside was one big room, with a twin bed against the back wall. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf, with some old books and cans of food that I definitely wasn't touching. There was a closet-sized bathroom with a compost toilet and a water jug system. No electricity, just a lantern and a few old candles. I brought a propane heater and a camp stove, but I still wanted to try using the wood stove for heat. Made me feel like I was earning it. I spent the rest of the afternoon clearing out dead mice and rat droppings from under the bed, cleaning the dust off the table, sweeping out spider webs. Found a few mouse skeletons in the drawers. By dusk, I had the fire-going sleeping bag unrolled and my hunting rifle leaning against the wall by the door. I ate beef jerky and canned beans for dinner and sat on the porch until the cold started to bite. That first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, at least not at first, but because the silence felt so unfamiliar. Every creak and pop of the cabin frame made me sit up and listen. Once I thought I heard a footstep on the porch, just one, but I figured it was in my head or maybe a raccoon. Still, I kept the rifle by the bed. The next morning was cold frost on the inside of the windows. I made coffee on the little camp stove and drank it outside bundled up in 3 layers. Around 6:30 a.m., I grabbed my rifle backpack and gear and started my hike up into the woods. The land out there is hilly, with a mix of maple oak and ash trees and a few rocky outcrops. I hiked for nearly 2 hours until I found a good blind near a game trail. Lots of hoof prints and scat nearby. I set up and sat still for a long time, listening to the wind, hoping to catch sight of a deer. By late morning, I saw movement and got my first shot. A buck, maybe 6 points. I clipped his shoulder and tracked him for nearly an hour. I finally found him collapsed near a creek bed. I gutted him there, tied the carcass up to a branch, and left him hanging while I hiked back to the truck for the sled. Took me 3 hours round trip, but I got him back to the cabin before sunset. I butchered him on a table outside and hung the quarters in the cold porch. My hands were raw and stiff with cold by the time I finished. But it felt good, real like I'd done something with my hands that mattered. That night, as I sat by the wood stove, I heard the sound again. A thud on the porch. Not a light step, more like something dropped. I froze. The fire popped. I listened. I didn't hear footsteps, no breathing, just that one sound. I weighted rifle across my lap until the fire burned down low. I finally opened the front door with the barrel of the rifle leading. Nothing, just frost, and one of the quarters from the buck was missing. It had been hanging on the porch hook, and now it wasn't there. I stepped out with my flashlight, and the beam caught the drag mark. Something had taken it. Not a bear. We don't really have bears in that part of Iowa. A coyote couldn't carry a leg that heavy. It had to be a person. That was the moment it changed. It went from peaceful retreat to something else. I closed and barred the door with a chair under the handle and didn't sleep that night either. Next day, I found the deer quarter about 200 FT downhill from the cabin. Half-eaten, like someone had hacked at it with a dull blade. Not teeth marks, cuts, but not clean cuts either. Looked like a hatchet, or maybe an old knife. I stood there staring at it, trying to decide if this was some messed up hunter prank, or if someone was just living out in the woods. Either way, I felt watched. I could feel it on the back of my neck. I made a point to fire off 2 rounds into the woods that afternoon. Not at anything, just into the trees. I figured if someone was watching, they'd think twice. That evening I was packing to leave. I had enough meat to fill my cooler, and I wasn't interested in sticking around. But I couldn't leave just yet. My battery had drained. I'd left the headlights on after unloading the deer. The truck wouldn't turn over, so I had to stay one more night. I slept in the corner, rifle in hand, eyes half open. The fire burned low. Around midnight, I heard it again, not on the porch, this time under the house. The cabin was raised about a foot off the ground, just enough crawl space for someone to fit. The scraping sound started slow, rhythmic like metal on wood, like someone was sawing through a floor beam. I stood up as quietly as I could, boots off, and moved to where the noise was coming from. I crouched ear to the floor. It stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then it started again, this time toward the back. I banged on the floorboard with the butt of the rifle as hard as I could. The scraping stopped. I threw on my boots, kicked open the door, and circled the cabin with my flashlight and rifle drawn. No one, just silence and frost. But I knew someone had been there. I stayed up the rest of the night. No fire, no light, just watching. At first light, I grabbed my jump box from under the seat of the truck, connected it, and thanked God when the engine turned over. I loaded up everything I could and drove out of there fast. Mirrors up, hand on the rifle the whole way. A few days later, I filed a report with the local game warden. They checked the cabin, but didn't find much. No footprints, no real evidence, just scratch marks under the cabin and the bones of the deer I'd butchered. They said there were rumors of squatters or someone living off-grid out there, some ex-con or survivalist type, but nothing solid. I never went back. I still hunt, but never alone. And never in a cabin that's been sitting empty for years. I keep thinking about those drag marks, the dull cuts on the meat, the scraping under the floor. Someone was out there watching, waiting, hiding. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. And that's what made it so much worse, because people are real, and they're always the scariest part. Is the scariest part. I was 33 years old when I spent a week alone in a cabin in the Scottish Highlands. It was late October of 2022, and I had just gone through a bad breakup with someone I had been living with for nearly 6 years. My job had me worn down, and everything in my flat reminded me of her. I wanted space, but not just space. I needed to feel like I had left everything behind for a while. I searched for something quiet and remote. I found a listing online for a timber lodge cabin about 20 minutes outside a small town called Pitlahari. It looked peaceful, surrounded by pine woods, and the listing promised no cell service and no Wi-Fi. That sounded like heaven at the time. I booked it for 7 days. The drive up was beautiful, mostly empty roads and fading autumn trees. The colors were dying rust reds and smoky yellows, and there was a chill in the air that let you know winter was crawling in early that year. The last hour of driving was up a thin, broken road barely wide enough for one car. Moss grew thick on either side of the gravel, and I didn't see another person or vehicle the entire time. The cabin finally appeared through the trees, small and dark, built on a slope that overlooked a patch of water so still it looked fake. There was no caretaker to greet me. The owners had left a key inside a tin box under a heavy rock by the door, and a typed-up welcome letter was on the table inside. The whole thing was very minimal. No television, no radio, just a wood-burning stove and a stack of firewood by the back door. There was electricity and plumbing, though, and the place didn't smell like rot or mold, which I had half expected. It was clean quiet, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could hear myself think. The first 2 days were uneventful in the best kind of way. I slept long hours, made tea, sat by the little window in the kitchen, and read some book I'd brought and barely touched back home. I walked through the woods a little each day, not too far at first, just enough to stretch my legs and get a feel for the place. The paths weren't really paths, just areas where the ground wasn't choked with thick undergrowth. The trees were old and close together, and the air always smelled like wet bark and fallen leaves. I didn't see another person the whole time. On the third evening, something shifted. It was just before sundown. I had gone for a longer walk than usual, probably about 2 hours out from the cabin, and I didn't bring my torch with me because the sky was still a pale gray, and I figured I'd make it back before dark. I was wrong. The trees thickened the farther I went, and when I finally turned back, the sun dropped behind the ridge too fast. The woods went dark almost instantly. I knew the general direction back, but in the trees, your sense of distance and time gets strange. I kept walking, listening to my boots squish into damp earth, trying not to think about what I'd do if I actually got lost. That's when I saw her. First, I didn't know what I was looking at. Between two trees up ahead, maybe 15 yards away, I saw what looked like a person just standing still. It was already dim enough that I couldn't see her face or any features, just her shape. She wasn't moving, not even swaying like you'd expect someone would in the cold, just still watching. My stomach tightened, and I stopped walking. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, but that didn't make sense. Nobody hikes out here this late in the evening, not without a torch or bright gear. She wasn't wearing anything reflective. It looked like she had on an old coat that hung down past her knees. Her arms were at her sides, and I couldn't even tell if she had a hood up or if her hair was just long. I turned my eyes away for a second to look around, and when I looked back, she was gone. I don't mean she walked off. I mean she wasn't there anymore. It didn't make sense. There was nowhere to go quickly from that spot. The trees were thick, and the ground was wet and loud with leaves. I didn't hear a single footstep. I walked faster after that. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Every step felt like something was behind me. Even though I never looked, I made it back to the cabin just before it went completely black. I locked the door and didn't sleep well that night. I kept trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was a tree. Maybe a shadow. My mind was tired. I hadn't talked to another human in days. The next morning, I walked out to the edge of the woods with a hot mug of coffee and stared in the direction I had seen her. I didn't go in. I just stood there for a while. The birds were quiet and the forest looked thicker than I remembered. I shook it off and tried to distract myself with small tasks. Sweeping the cabin, chopping wood walking down to the water. I didn't see anyone the whole day, but the sense that I was being watched didn't leave. That night, just after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud. It was light and rhythmic, a soft scraping. I sat up in bed and listened. The sound came again, like something brushing lightly against the side of the cabin. Not quite scratching more, like dragging. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, holding my breath. I wanted to believe it was a branch swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. Everything outside was still. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the fire poker I'd taken from the fireplace. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. There were no marks on the side of the cabin, no Fagan branches, nothing. I checked the back too, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were small, round patches of mud near the back steps, like someone had been standing there barefoot. Not deep footprints, just dirty impressions on the wooden boards. They weren't mine. I didn't have cell service, but I packed a bag and hiked 2 hours into the direction of the road where the reception sometimes flickered in and out. I texted my brother back in Edinburgh. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, so I just said, I thought I saw someone in the woods, and that it made me uneasy. He told me to call the police if it got worse. I didn't know what I'd even tell them. I stayed the rest of the day by the fire. I didn't sleep. On the 5th day, I found something hanging on a tree branch just outside the cabin. It was a long strand of hair tied in a knot. Human hair, dark brown, maybe black. It was wrapped around a thin stick, like a small bundle. I took it down with a cloth and burned it in the stove. I felt sick. That wasn't something you just found by accident. Somebody had put it there. And not recently either. It looked damp and rotted at the edges, like it had been there overnight in the dew. I didn't even go inside after that. I grabbed my bag, tossed in what I could, locked the cabin out of habit, and started walking. I wasn't waiting for the week to end anymore. I was done. I walked fast, almost jogged, until I got to the spot where my car was parked off the road. When I got there, I found both my tires slashed on the right side, not flat from age or damage, cut clean and deep. I stared at the rubber for a long time. There were no other cars, no other signs of anyone being up there, just me. I didn't cry or scream or anything like that. I just sat on the hood of the car and waited. I figured someone would drive by eventually. It took almost 4 hours before an older man in a Land Rover came by and stopped. I flagged him down and explained that my tires had blown. I didn't mention the woman. He gave me a ride into Pitlahari, and I paid to have the car towed and fixed. I spent the last night in a cheap room above a pub. I didn't go back to the cabin. A few weeks later, I called the owners and told them about the damage to the tires and that I thought someone had been around the property during my stay. They seemed polite but indifferent. They said nobody had ever reported anything like that before. Maybe it was just wildlife. Maybe it was my imagination. I didn't argue. I hung up and never spoke to them again. But I still think about that woman, about how still she was, about how quiet the woods got after I saw her. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I know she was real. I know what I saw. I know the prints were real. The hair, the scratches. And every now and then, I still dream about the sound she made walking around the cabin in the dark. That soft dragging noise, that impossible silence between the trees, and how, even though I never saw her face, I felt her looking at me. I haven't been back to the Highlands since I don't think I ever will. I don't think I ever will. It was the spring of 2017 when everything finally caught up to me. I was 33 at the time, living in Asheville, North Carolina, working long hours at a small architecture firm downtown. My boss wasn't cruel or anything, but the constant deadlines, the clatter of keyboards, the meetings that dragged on for hours, and the pressure to keep up with competition had worn me down to the bone. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd lost weight without trying. My eyes always looked hollow, and my hands shook when I held my morning coffee. One morning, I sat in my car outside the office parking deck and couldn't move. I just stared at the steering wheel for maybe an hour. I wasn't crying or panicking. I just couldn't go in. I turned off the engine and drove straight home. That night, I went online and started looking for places to stay away from everything. No phones, no computers, no people. I ended up on a local forum where someone posted about an old hunting cabin up in the hills near Nantala National Forest. It had no electricity, no plumbing, but it was far out and quiet. Supposedly belonged to some guy's grandfather who passed away years back. The owner said he didn't use it and didn't care who did just that. People didn't destroy it. He even dropped a pin to it on a private message. It wasn't on any rental site, not even listed on a map. I saved the location and didn't tell anyone. I just packed my truck and left 3 days later. The drive took about 4 hours. Once I passed the usual scenic turnouts and the smaller state roads, I started climbing gravel paths, winding up hills. I stopped seeing houses after the first hour. Eventually, I reached a point where the road ended, and I had to leave the truck and hike the rest of the way. I strapped on my backpack, grabbed my supplies, and started walking through the trees. No trails, no signs, just thick woods, and the GPS that on my phone. The forest was quiet and heavy. The deeper I went, the older everything seemed. Moss clung to the trees in sheets. Thick vines dangled overhead. I saw no trash, no footprints, no paths carved by other campers. It was the kind of place that didn't want to be found. Took me about 2 hours of slow climbing and weaving through trees before I saw the roof line. The cabin was set back against a slope mostly hidden by brush. It wasn't large, maybe 20 ft across. The wooden walls were dark gray, almost black, and the roof sagged in the middle like it was tired. One corner looked like it had sunk slightly into the ground. A small porch wrapped around the front, though the railing had collapsed on one side. A rusted oil lantern sat crooked on a nail by the door. I pushed open the door. It wasn't locked and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, old paper, and something like rust. There were 2 small windows on either side, covered in grime and spidery webs, but enough light crept in to see the inside. The main room had a cot against one wall with a mildewed mattress. A stone fireplace and a broken rocking chair tipped on its side. A rough wooden table stood in the middle, one leg propped up with a stack of folded newspaper. A few shelves lined the wall, still holding some tin cans and jars filled with who knows what. I dropped my gear and set to work cleaning up. I swept out leaves and dead bugs, laid out my sleeping bag on the cot, and opened all the windows to air out the place. By the time I finished, the sun was already sliding down behind the trees. I ate a cold dinner from a can, set up a small battery-powered lantern on the table, and tried to relax. The silence hit me hardest. Back in Asheville, even in the dead of night, there were always cars, or sirens, or neighbors talking. Here, it was just stillness, no wind, no birds, just me, and the creaking of old wood. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to doze off, I heard something shift. Sometimes it was the groan of the walls or the soft thump of something falling outside. A few times I sat up and held my breath, trying to figure out if I was just hearing things. I told myself it was just an old place, settling, nothing more. I spent the next day exploring the area. I marked trees with chalk so I wouldn't get lost, and followed a dry stream bed for a couple miles. I didn't see any signs of other people. No campsites, no rabbis, not even footprints. I started to feel like I was the only one to have walked there in years. But then I noticed something strange near the cabin on the way back. Behind it, hidden in the brush, there was a path of trampled grass. Not fresh, but not too old either. It led downhill, away from the direction I'd come. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed it. It wasn't long before I came to a small clearing, maybe 100 yards from the cabin. In the center was a pile of old junk. Rusted tools, a tire rim broken with planks. But what stood out to me was a large animal cage. It was mostly collapsed and covered in moss, but you could still see the frame. It looked like the kind used for trapping big game. Next to it was a rope pulley system attached to a tree. Something about it unsettled me. I couldn't explain why. Maybe because it didn't fit. If this had just been a hunting cabin, why was there a large cage like that? Why all the junk piled so neatly in one spot? Why hadn't the owner mentioned any of this? That night, I locked the cabin door, with a spare latch I brought. I kept my lantern on low and stayed up reading until I couldn't hold my eyes open anymore. But I woke up again around 3:00 a.m. There was a sound outside, not just the trees, a definite crunching like footsteps in leaves. They were slow, deliberate. I froze in my sleeping bag and listened. My heartbeat sounded louder than the noise itself. Then silence. Nothing moved for a while. Then I heard it again, closer to the back wall this time. Something brushing against the wood. I didn't move. I didn't get up. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just lay there, eyes wide, for what felt like an hour until it stopped. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of animals or people. But I noticed something strange. The back window had a small smudge on the glass, like a palm print. Couldn't be sure. It was faint. Could have been from years ago, but it hadn't been there when I cleaned that window the first day. I was on edge the rest of the day. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, but I'd seen bear prints before. They didn't sound like that. They didn't brush walls, and they sure as hell didn't leave handprints. I thought about packing up, but something made me stay. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself I was just imagining things. That night, I didn't sleep in the cabin. I took my gear and hiked back down the path toward the clearing and set up my tent in a spot behind a large rock. I wanted to see if anyone would approach the cabin again if it seemed empty. I stayed up the whole night wrapped in a blanket, watching the cabin through a pair of cheap binoculars I'd brought. Nothing happened for hours, just darkness and the occasional flicker of moonlight through clouds. Then sometime around 2 or 3, I saw movement. A figure stepped into view from the left, walking slowly toward the front porch. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. No flashlight, no back, just a dark shape, moving carefully, almost cautiously. They stopped at the door and seemed to lean forward, maybe listening. Then they slowly circled around the side of the cabin, disappearing behind it. I waited. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. The figure never came back into view. I stayed frozen until sunrise. In the morning, I checked the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. I know I had latched it. Inside, nothing looked taken, but a corner of my sleeping bag had been pulled back like someone had peeked inside it. I left that day. I packed everything up, hiked down to the truck without stopping, and drove straight home. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even go online to message the guy who posted the location. Months later, I tried to look up the pin again. The thread was gone. His account was deleted. I searched for any information about that area, news reports, old maps forums. Nothing ever came up about a cabin in that location. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone else had claimed it. Maybe it was being used for something not meant to be found. All I know is that silence wasn't normal. That place wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting for something or someone. And I'm just glad it wasn't waiting for me. Wasn't waiting for me. It was the summer of 1990 when I decided to take a week off from my busy life in Minneapolis and escape to the woods near Red Pine Ridge, a place I'd always been curious about, but never visited. The town of Pine Creek was small, tucked away in the northern part of Minnesota, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. I had heard stories about the quiet cabins there, many owned by people who came to get away from the city's noise and stress. My own neighbor, Jim Keller, was one such person. Jim was a retired cop. He had served in the Minneapolis Police Department for nearly 30 years before moving to Pine Creek a few years back. Jim was in his mid-60s, tall, sturdy, with a weathered face that told stories of hard years on the force. He never talked much about his work, but you could tell from the way he carried himself and his eyes that he had seen things most people hadn't. We got along well enough in the neighborhood, and when I told him I wanted to spend some time in the woods, he offered me the use of his cabin for the week. I hadn't been there before, but I accepted. The cabin was about 30 minutes' drive from town, at the end of a long gravel road that twisted through thick pine trees. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and earth. Jim had left a key under the doormat just like he said he would. The cabin was modest but sturdy. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. Inside it was cozy. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen, with the basics, a couple of beds, and a shelf full of books and old hunting magazines. Jim had left me a note on the table, reminding me to be careful in the woods and to lock up at night. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking my things, and exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick but beautiful. Birds chirped in the trees, and every now and then I caught sight of squirrels or a deer bounding away into the underbrush. It felt good to be away from the city's constant buzz and bright lights. At night, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, far brighter than anything I could see back home. The second day was quiet too. I spent most of it walking along a trail that led to a small lake a couple of miles from the cabin. The water was clear and cold, perfect for a swim. I thought about Jim and his life here. Being a retired cop must have been a strange change. Going from the chaos of the city to this quiet, isolated place. I wondered if he missed it sometimes, or if the calm suited him better. That evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, I noticed a pickup truck slowly making its way down the gravel road toward the cabin. I recognized it immediately. It was Jim's. The truck pulled up. Just as the last light disappeared behind the trees, Jim stepped out, his face creased with a tired smile. "I thought I'd stop by for a bit," he said without much fuss. He carried a small box, which he set on the porch table. We didn't say much, but his presence felt reassuring. He showed me around the cabin, pointing out little things about the area. The best fishing spots, which trails to avoid after dark, how the weather changed quickly in these parts. After a while, he left, promising to check in again in a few days. The third day began with a heavy mist hanging low in the forest. It made the woods look strange and silent, as if the trees were holding their breath. I decided to stay close to the cabin, reading and fixing myself simple meals. The stillness outside was almost too perfect, like the kind of quiet you notice only after you've been used to constant noise. That night, I heard noises that made me sit up straight. First, I thought it was just the wind. The trees creaked and the roof rattled softly, but then I heard something else. A low snapping, like someone stepping on dry branches just beyond the tree line. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray deer, but the footsteps were slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen shelf and went outside. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the nearest trees, but I saw nothing. The forest was still. I checked all the locks and windows twice before going back inside and sitting by the stove with a cup of coffee until I felt calm enough to sleep. The next morning, Jim showed up again. This time, he brought a shotgun and some extra supplies. Without much explanation, he told me it was better to be safe than sorry around here, especially at night. You're not far from logging roads and some old hunting trails, he said. Sometimes people come through here who don't belong. You have to watch out. I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. Jim stayed for a few hours, helping me stack some firewood and checking the cabin security. Before he left, he gave me a stern look. If anything feels off, don't hesitate to call me. I don't live far. His words stuck with me long after he drove away. That night, the noises came again, louder this time. I was reading by the window when I heard the crunch of gravel on the driveway. Someone was coming up the road. I peeked outside, but only saw darkness and shadows moving between the trees. Then I saw a figure, a man walking slowly toward the cabin. His clothes were dark, and he moved with a purpose that didn't feel right. My heart pounded as I locked the door and sat down, clutching the shotgun Jim had left behind the door. I waited, listening, as the man stopped near the porch, his footsteps heavy on the wooden boards. I could hear him breathing steady but deep. He must have seen the light through the window. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the forest. I sat frozen for a long time before I could bring myself to sleep. The next day, I called Jim. He arrived within the hour, his face grim. He immediately began looking around, checking the perimeter and the nearby woods. He told me about people who had been caught sneaking onto private properties in the area, hunters who didn't respect boundaries, thieves looking for easy targets. Jim said he'd stay for the night. That night, we sat in the cabin, the windows covered with thick blankets to block the light. The shotgun was loaded and ready. Jim kept a close watch, his eyes sharp, even in the dim light. Around midnight, there was the sound again. The crunching gravel footsteps, soft whispers. We both sat silently waiting. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. The man tried to force it open. Jim aimed the shotgun and shouted. The man fled. Jim called the police immediately. It turned out the man was a local troublemaker wanted for several burglaries and petty crimes. The police caught him the next day, hiding in the woods nearby. The rest of the week passed without incident. I stayed alert, but began to feel safer, knowing Jim was close by and that the police were watching the area more carefully. When I left, Jim shook my hand firmly. Next time you want to get away, just let me know. We'll keep you safe, driving back to Minneapolis. I thought about how quiet the woods had seemed before all this, but now I knew there was a darker side to that silence. One that Jim, with all his years of experience, was ready to face. This trip taught me that danger isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's the quiet footsteps in the dark, the shadows that don't quite belong, and the weight of knowing you have to be ready. I'm grateful for Jim, my neighbor, the retired cop, who reminded me that being prepared and alert can make all the difference, The year was 1997. I was 29, and I'd been living in the small mountain town of Ridgewood, Oregon, for a little over 2 years. It was the kind of place where the roads were mostly dirt or cracked asphalt. The stores were family-run, and the people didn't lock their doors most of the time. Ridgewood was surrounded by thick pine forests and low mountains, perfect for hiking, fishing, and camping. I liked it because it was quiet, and it let me be alone when I needed to. That autumn after work, one Friday, I decided to get away for a weekend. I wanted to camp, but I didn't want to deal with the usual tent setup or noisy campgrounds. A friend had mentioned a remote glass cabin owned by a family friend, about an hour's drive into the woods. The cabin was mostly made of thick glass panels, with wooden frames built right on a ridge overlooking a narrow river valley. The owner was out of town and had offered it to me to use for the weekend. I was drawn to the idea. The thought of sleeping surrounded by glass, seeing the forest up close, waking to the morning light filtering through the trees, was enough to convince me. I packed my old backpack with essentials: a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my hunting knife. The sky was overcast, a soft drizzle falling as I started the drive from town. I left just before sunset, hoping to arrive before dark. The dirt road was rough, winding between tall firs and spruces, the tires crunching on wet gravel. I parked near a small trailhead, then lugged my pack up the steep hill. After about a 20-minute hike through thick brush and fallen leaves, I saw it. The glass cabin. It was exactly as described, a small square building with floor-to-ceiling glass walls on all sides, except for a solid wooden door on the east side. The frame was made of dark wood, stained almost black from years of weather. The roof was a flat, slanted design, covered with moss and pine needles. The cabin sat on wooden stilts above a rocky slope with a narrow deck wrapping around two sides. I stepped onto the deck water, dripping from the trees onto the wooden boards. The air smelled fresh and cold, the faint scent of pine resin mixed with damp earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Inside was simple but cozy. A small wood stove stood in the corner, with a pile of logs beside it. A folding table and two chairs sat near the far wall. A mattress lay on the floor, covered by a thin blanket. The floor was rough wooden planks, worn but sturdy. The glass walls gave a full view of the forest around me. I could see the river winding far below its surface, barely visible through the mist hanging low in the valley. I set my pack down, lit the stove, and unpacked a little food. As the fire warmed the room, the chill in the air softened. I ate a simple dinner: canned beans, heated in a pot bread, and some dried fruit. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray. Night fell quickly. The glass cabin turned into a small, glowing box in the dark woods. I drew the curtain on the door for privacy, but the other walls remained clear. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. I settled onto the mattress with my flashlight and a book, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling, the sense of being watched. It wasn't like fear, more like a prickling at the back of my neck, a tension in my muscles. I looked out the window toward the trees. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, a tree stump, or a large rock, but he moved. A man standing just beyond the edge of the clearing near a cluster of fir trees, about 40 feet away. His clothes were dark, blending with the night, He stood perfectly still watching the cabin. My heart jumped. I blinked, and he was still there. No flashlight, no movement, just eyes fixed on me. The glass reflected the cabin's interior faintly, but his figure was clear, dark against the lighter fog. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal here, no phone line, no cell. I considered grabbing my knife and stepping outside, but the rain had left the ground muddy and slippery. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with a man watching me. He didn't move for what felt like minutes. I sat frozen, trying to slow my breathing. Then slowly, he turned and vanished into the trees. I waited, every nerve on edge, for hours. The night felt endless, every sound amplified. Twice I thought I heard footsteps nearby, but whenever I shone my flashlight outside, there was nothing but dark trunks and fog. The next morning, I didn't sleep much. I kept my knife close and stayed inside, moving only when the sun was up and the forest looked safer. I left the curtains open, hoping the man wouldn't return. When I went outside to explore, I noticed footprints in the muddy earth around the cabin. Large booted prints leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin side and back again. They were fresh. I spent the day tense but careful. I didn't hear or see anyone else, but the prints worried me. I packed extra firewood and food preparing in case I needed to stay longer or defend myself. That night, I heard faint noises, low whispers carried by the wind, the crack of a branch breaking, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin. I huddled near the stove, the knife in my hand, eyes glued to the glass walls. Hours passed without anything visible. Then just before dawn, I saw him again, the man standing at the far edge of the clearing. This time, he was closer, his face partially visible in the dim light. He looked tired, but watchful eyes locked on me. He stayed for only a moment, then disappeared again into the trees. I spent the rest of that day gathering my things. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. The cabin, beautiful and peaceful in daylight, felt like a trap at night. On my way down the hill, I followed the footprints I had seen. They led into the woods, then stopped abruptly near a broken-down hunting blind. Inside the blind, I found discarded cans, a tattered blanket, and a small campfire pit, cold and covered in ash. Someone had been living there, watching the cabin for days or weeks. I took pictures with my phone and sent them to the local sheriff once I got signal near the town. Back in Ridgewood, the sheriff told me the man was a known drifter who had been reported stalking hikers and campers in the area for months. He was dangerous, but had managed to avoid capture. I never went back to that glass cabin. The memory of those nights being watched and hunted in a place so open and exposed stayed with me, with the forest so beautiful and still, in the day, had a hidden side. The man in the dark woods was real, and he was still out there somewhere waiting. I'm Jack Harris. I'm 32 years old, and this all happened back in the summer of 2018. I still think about that trip a lot, and even though it's been years, the feeling of that week still lingers in my mind like a thick fog you can't shake off. I've always liked the outdoors, the quiet, the slow pace you get when you're away from the city's noise. My work as a freelance graphic designer allowed me the freedom to choose where I worked, so I'd often take off for a few days or weeks to get some fresh air and focus on my projects. That summer, I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin I rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. The cabin was about 25 milers from the nearest town, tucked away by a small, slow-moving river. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden building about 20 ft by 15 with a tin roof that looked like it had weathered many storms. There was no running water or electricity, just a wood stove, a small kitchen with basic utensils, and a bed with a worn-out mattress. The owner had promised me it was perfect for anyone who wanted to get away and be alone with nature. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine and wet earth. It had rained the day before, so everything was damp. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was lined with tall spruce and fir trees that blocked most of the sunlight. I parked my old pickup truck near the cabin and unloaded my bags. Inside, the place smelled faintly with smoke and mustiness, like it had been closed up for a while. I spent the first day unpacking, chopping some firewood, and setting up my workspace near the small window that looked out over the river. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional bird, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant call of a lawn on the lake beyond the trees. My phone had barely any signal, which I expected, so I wasn't worried. I wanted to disconnect anyway. Over the next couple of days, I settled into a rhythm. Mornings were cool, sometimes foggy. I would make coffee on the stove, eat some oatmeal, then work for a few hours, drawing on my tablet using a solar charger to keep it powered. Afternoons, I'd explore the woods, follow the river, or just sit outside watching the clouds drift by. Evenings were for making a fire, cooking simple meals, and reading by lantern light. But around the third night, things started to feel off. It began with the sounds. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noises were too deliberate, too close. Something was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a bear sniffing around. I kept a hunting knife on the table just in case. That night, after the fire had died down to embers, I sat by the window with a flashlight on, watching the dark woods. The trees stood like silent giant shadows, shifting as the wind blew. Suddenly, I noticed a shape moving among the trees, something tall and hunched, stepping carefully but purposefully. It wasn't an animal. I froze, heart pounding. The figure stopped just long enough to disappear behind a tree. I considered calling the police, but my phone had no signal. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and I had no way to get help quickly. I stayed inside, locked the door, and waited till dawn. The next morning, I found deep footprints near the edge of the clearing, too big to be a deer or bear. The prints were fresh with mud still clinging between the toes. They led toward the river and then disappeared. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone else staying nearby, but I didn't see any other vehicles or signs of life. The only road was the gravel path I came in on, and it looked undisturbed. I decided to stay alert. I packed my backpack with essentials, including a small camping stove, some food, water, and my knife, and I planned to explore further down the river to see if I could find any clues about who or what was out there. The forest was thick, the ground soft and damp underfoot. I walked for hours following the river, scanning the tree-line for any signs. The sun was strong, and the smells of earth moss and pine were heavy in the air. Around late afternoon, I spotted a small campfire site on the riverbank. cold ashes, broken branches, arranged for a fire, and some footprints nearby. The prints were bigger than mine and looked fresh. No gear or belongings left behind, though. The place gave me a chill, but I kept moving, heading back toward the cabin, just as the sun started to drop. That night, the noises came back louder this time. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. I grabbed my knife and stayed near the window again. Suddenly, a loud banging on the door startled me. I jumped back, heart racing. The banging continued, hard, sharp knocks. I didn't open it. Instead, I grabbed my backpack, threw some food and water inside, and prepared to leave. If someone was out there, I wasn't going to stay another night. I waited a few minutes, then cautiously opened the door to see if anyone was there. Nothing, only the woods. No footprints in the mud, no signs of anyone nearby. The night was cold and still. I packed everything in my truck as fast as I could, double-checking the doors and windows, my hands trembling. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure standing just beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I drove away fast, the headlights cutting through the darkness, my mind racing. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway and had a strong cell signal. I called the ranger station, told them about the strange footprints and noises. They said they'd send someone to check it out. A week later, I learned that the rangers found evidence of an illegal camp hidden deep in the woods with signs of poaching and drug activity. No suspects were ever caught. I never went back to that cabin. That trip taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're just people hidden in the dark, watching. It was the spring of 2019 when I finally took some time off work to start building a small off-grid cabin in a clearing I found near the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. I was 31 at the time, burned out from my desk job in Portland, and I needed a break from everything. People screens, traffic noise. I'd bought 5 acres of wooded land a year before, that not too far from the town of Glide, and I'd been slowly clearing it during weekends when I could make the 3-hour drive south. But now, I had 3 full weeks off, and I planned to spend the first one building the shell of a small one-room cabin by myself. The land wasn't anything fancy, just a narrow strip of fir and pine, with a clearing about 100 yards in from where I parked my old Tacoma on a gravel pull-off. There wasn't a driveway or anything yet. No running water, no utilities, just forest deer birds, and quiet. I'd already brought in the lumber during my last few trips and stacked it under a big green tarp in the clearing. I had a generator, some tools, 2 sawhorses, and all the hardware I'd need. I'd studied a dozen simple cabin blueprints online and drew up a rough plan based on a few of them. I wasn't a contractor, but I knew how to use a hammer and square, and I'd helped my uncle frame a deck once when I was a teenager. I figured it couldn't be that different. I'd also brought a tent and planned to camp on site the whole time. I liked the idea of waking up where I was building. No driving in and out. Just get up, make some instant coffee, and start cutting wood. I had enough fuel for the generator, plenty of canned food, a water jug, a small first aid kit, and my Glock 19 locked in a dry bag just in case. Not that I expected trouble. The land was remote. The only people who knew I was out there were my younger brother and a guy I worked with. It rained the first night, not just a drizzle cold, steady rain that pounded the rainfly of the tent and soaked the clearing. I laid awake listening to it while the wind pressed the sides of the tent in and made the trees groan and sway above. I hadn't expected that much rain in early May, but the forecast had looked iffy when I left, and I figured I'd just push through. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, tried to ignore how damp the floor was getting, and told myself it would clear up by morning. Didn't. By the time I crawled out of the tent around 6:30 a.m., everything was wet. My boots were wet. My gloves were wet. The tarp over the lumber had held, but the edges were dripping, and the ground was mud. My breath fogged in the cold morning air, and I started the little propane burner to make coffee while raindrops tapped on the canopy above. The forest smelled sharp and green and earthy. Even with the rain, I started building. I figured the footing piers needed to go in first, so I used my post hole digger and shovel to clear 8 holes where I'd marked with spray paint. Each one had to be about 18 in deep, and the soil was soft enough. But every time I lifted the digger, water started pooling at the bottom. I tried bailing it out with a plastic cup and worked fast to get concrete poured in before the holes turned into little ponds. It wasn't perfect, but I figured it would do. That first day was all digging and pouring. My jacket was soaked through by 10:00 a.m., and my jeans clung to my legs with a wet heaviness that never went away. My gloves tore on the edges of the wheelbarrow as I mixed bag after bag of concrete and tamped it around the sauna tubes. I was too stubborn to stop. I wanted to at least finish the piers. By the time I got the last one set, the sun was setting behind the trees, though I hadn't seen it all day. Back in the tent that night, the rain came even harder. I changed into dry clothes, but the tent floor was starting to leak. I'd laid it on top of a tarp, but water found its way through the seams anyway. I sat hunched over, eating kimchi from a pan, and listening to the wind shake the trees. I'd never felt unsafe in the woods before, but that night I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the brush just beyond the tent. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I wasn't sure. I unzipped the tent flap once and pointed my flashlight toward the tree line, but I didn't see anything except streaks of rain and swaying limbs. Still, I didn't sleep much. The next day was more of the same. Gray sky, soaking rain, and mud that sucked at my boots when I walked. I laid the floor beams across the piers and spent most of the day framing the base. It was satisfying in a way, hammering things together in the middle of nowhere, the sound of it echoing between the trees. But my hands were starting to blister, and the generator was sputtering more than I liked. I was careful with the fuel, but I worried about running out before I finished. On the third night, something felt wrong. I'd crawled into my tent again after a long day cutting and assembling wall frames. My body sore from hauling wood and lifting alone. The forest was dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without the flashlight. I was almost asleep when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal, not a rustle, not a branch breaking. It was a heavy thud, like something dropping onto the ground, followed by silence, then another thud. I held my breath. I thought maybe something had fallen from a tree, a big pine cone, a broken branch. But then I heard what sounded like slow steps, muddy squishing steps around the far side of the clearing. Too heavy for a raccoon, not fast enough for a deer. I didn't move, just stayed still in the sleeping bag, listening. The steps circled slowly, maybe 30 feet away. Then nothing, just wind and rain again. I waited half an hour before unzipping the bag and grabbing the Glock from the dry bag. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't shine the light. I just waited wide-eyed, barely breathing. By morning, nothing was out there. No footprints in the mud, not that I could see. I told myself, maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe the rain just played tricks on my ears. I kept building anyway. The cabin started taking shape. I got the walls up by the 5th day, though the back one was a little crooked, and I had to brace it with extra boards to keep it steady. The rain never stopped, and the mud around the site was almost kneed in spots. My tent had started to collapse in the corners, so I moved it under the cabin frame and slept on top of the floor platform the next night wrapped in a tarp. That night, I heard the steps again. This time, they came closer. I was half asleep when the sound of squishing mud woke me up closer than before, just beyond the unfinished walls. I laid completely still wrapped in the tarp, the Glock in my hand. The steps came around the side, then stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone or something was standing just feet away from me, probably looking in through the open wall frames. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then slowly, the steps moved off back into the woods. I listened to them fade into the rain. The next morning I found tracks in the mud, boot prints, human boot prints. They weren't mine. They were bigger, deeper. They came in from the woods, circled the cabin, and walked back out toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I was too far from town. I didn't have cell service. I could hike out, drive back, tell someone. But who? And what would I say? That someone walked around my cabin one night in the rain? I told myself it was probably a hunter. Maybe just someone lost. Maybe they saw the tarp and the tools and figured someone was working there. Maybe they didn't mean harm, but they came at night in the rain and didn't say a word. I finished the roof on the 6th day. Just a simple pitch tin roof with a small overhang on one side. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the inside dry. I decided not to stay that night. I packed my gear, loaded the truck, and took one last look at the muddy clearing with the half-finished cabin standing there like a skeleton in the woods. I drove back to Portland in silence, glancing in the rearview mirror, too often like I expected to see someone following. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a while. 2 weeks later, I came back during a clear weekend with a friend. He brought his shotgun. We found new footprints in the mud near the cabin. Not mine, not his. We finished the cabin, and one more trip sealed it up, put a lock on the door, and left a trail camera in the trees. The camera was gone the next time I checked. Just the plastic mount left screwed into the trunk. I haven't slept out there since. The cabin still stands, but I don't. Not at night. Not alone. Not alone.